Hello. Before we get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pitches. Thanks to our latest donor, Virginie Jacoberger Levue. Apologies if that's a horribly mangled pronunciation.
We emailed Virginie to ask a bit more about her, but we haven't heard back, but nonetheless, we're very grateful to her for her support.
If you pledge $10 a month, you get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26 alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be really helpful when organising interview material. You also get access to a series of mini-episodes from previous guests on the show, in which they answer 3 revealing questions. The latest episode features Ed Needham, the former editor of FHM and the editor of Strong Words magazine. Here's a snippet.
And really good piece of advice I heard the other day was that all creative writers should at some point drive a taxi rather than doing your MFA or going on some elaborate course. You can see all of humanity in all its glory, all its awfulness, driving a taxi and looking at it in the rearview mirror. So my second question, or the second question of Always Take Notes, is tell us about a time you failed.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and I spoke with Terri White, who is editor-in-chief of Empire magazine and also a memoirist.
We spoke to Terri about her entry into journalism and working at Laz Magazines, about becoming an editor-in-chief of Shortlist magazine before the age of 30, and about Coming Undone, her memoir of mental illness.
It's a fascinating episode and we hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, Terri, to Always Take Notes. Thank you so much for your time. Could we start by talking about Coming Undone, your memoir, and the pieces that it grew out of?
Yeah, so it actually started life as a series of 50-word stories. So I had been in a psychiatric hospital in New York, and when I came out, I was doing AA. I was trying not to go out too much. I suddenly discovered I had all of these hours in my days and nights to fill, and a friend suggested that I start writing these little stories as a way to kind of process being hospitalised, but also just as something to fill my time, quite honestly. And that kind of grew over the years. They grew into, I suppose, longer short stories. And at that point, it was never the intention to write a book. I was just writing for the sake of writing, really. I'd always written. I hate the kind of therapeutic thing, but it's absolutely true. It really helped me process things over my entire life, actually. And then that grew and grew, and I started to write 2 very distinct parts, one of which was my experience in New York when I had the breakdown, which preceded my hospitalisation, and then my early years. And as they both grew, it became apparent to me that there may well be a book there.
And what was the decision to write about something that was so personal? You know, it's been extremely well reviewed on publication and people have really said it struck a chord with them. But for you yourself, having been through these difficult experiences, how did you feel about burying yourself in such a way?
Well, it's funny because I'm a journalist by trade, and you know, there's a lot of confessional journalism these days. But when I started out, it wasn't such a huge thing, and it was something I never did. I never liked writing about myself. I believe journalism is the act of uncovering other people's stories. And so I always veered away from first person, from revealing too much about myself. So it did take a bit of a leap, I think, to be able to actually do that. But I kind of felt this weird compulsion to tell the truth. And the more my recovery went on and I tried to kind of deal with my mental health issues and the trauma, my early life trauma that had grown out of, it became apparent to me that I had to begin to tell the truth in one way or another. And as I was writing, it kind of, to be honest, it just fell out of me. I can't even say that it was particularly strategic or a decision I made. I just started writing about particularly my childhood, and it just all kept coming, and I was writing about things that I didn't even know I remembered, and it took on a life of its own, to be honest. But I'm glad I didn't kind of have in my mind, oh, I want to write this book, I'm going to have to dig into this bit of my life. I think the organic way it came out was for the good.
And when you realised that you had this material, was that sort of as it is in the book, or did it take a lot of sort of recrafting once you attach an editor onto it?
Not a huge amount, I have to say, and it's very close to what first came out. Obviously, I did a lot of editing myself before I sent it to my editor at Canongate, but the style that I write in, especially the childhood stuff, is quite stream of consciousness, and it's not always linear, and it doesn't follow a particular, I suppose, prescriptive style. It's very much, a lot of it is in my head, a lot of it is I'm trying to articulate what it's like to feel seriously mentally ill, to feel completely lost, to feel completely unmoored from yourself. I was trying to capture exactly what that felt like, and a lot of that just kind of spilled out as I was writing it, and then I didn't want to too heavily edit that into being something a little bit more artificial. I wanted it to be as raw and representative of how that felt as possible.
One thing that we really like to go into on the podcast is the kind of mechanics of how people get book deals and so forth. So in terms of, getting an agent, getting a publisher, how was this book sold? Was there a proposal, or what was the process for that?
Well, I know nothing about the book world, I should say. And I think people think if you're a journalist or I'm a magazine editor, that you must also know about publishing and probably know loads of people. And I know lots of people who've written books, but I know nothing about the publishing world, so I didn't really know what to do, and I hadn't fully decided to write the book when I first got my agent. So what happened is, a friend of mine, his wife, who had worked at Faber for 20 years, was setting up her own agency, Anna Pillai, and she took me out for coffee and actually said, "Oh, I'm starting this literary agency. Do you have a book in you?" I was thinking some funny, maybe sex book or dating book. She probably didn't expect me to come back with harrowing memoir at that point. Funny sex book wasn't actually what she got, but and so I just told her at this coffee meeting. I said, "Well, actually, this happened to me in New York. Nobody knows about it. I've kept it a secret essentially, but I have been writing about it." And I sent her some early stuff I'd written. She really liked it, and she helped me craft it into a proposal, which I only then had 2 meetings with 2 publishers, and absolutely fell in love with the team at Canongate, who completely got what I wanted to do, was completely up for the book being kind of a non-traditional memoir and not following that 3-act structure. I think if I'd have taken it elsewhere, there would have been much more pressure to maybe make it more palatable, because it's very graphic in places, but also to have, I suppose, a more traditional ending, the redemption, the resolution, which absolutely isn't in my book at all.
Well, that was one of the things I was wondering about, is whether publishers were wary of the material when you sort of took it to market. But I guess you sort of hinted at the climate around confessional writing has changed, and I assume also sort of in the wake of Me Too and things like that, it was a much more receptive audience.
Yeah, I think it's still challenging, because I think people there are still boundaries of what is considered palatable and what is considered unpalatable. So I write about self-harm in a lot of detail. I write about childhood sexual abuse in a lot of detail. I write about my fantasies of killing the man who abused me. There's very little I didn't write about, and for me it was really important that it was written in a very detailed and realistic way, because as somebody who'd been mentally unwell and had looked to books before to kind of help me not even work my way through it, but just see my experience reflected back, I found a lot of what I read quite sanitised and not in any way reflective for me of the absolute, honestly grim horror that it was to be abused, that it was to self-harm and hurt yourself like that. So that was a hard line for me, that had to be in the book. And Canongate were incredibly supportive. They're a very bold publisher. I don't know if a more traditional publisher would have been as comfortable. And I think it's challenging for audiences. I think a couple of people have said to me that they found bits of it really uncomfortable, that they found it too graphic, that it upset them too much, that they found it too raw. And I think they're all completely valid opinions, but I didn't, I have to say, have anybody else's reception in mind when I was writing it, not even my publishers. I very strongly felt like I had to tell a specific story, and I think I was just very lucky that I had a publisher that entirely supported that.
Could you unpack a bit this idea that you mentioned of the kind of redemption obligation in this kind of book? The idea, as you say, that there's a set out 3-act structure that you go to kind of nadir and then resolution. Do you think, and particularly more broadly in the way that people, I often find interesting in discussion and in writing about mental health, there's a feeling that it has to be retrospective, that you have to have this idea that you have reached this kind of state of zen, of resolution of your issues, and you can look back on it. And I would agree with you that I think that's reductive. But would you say that is a kind of mold that these books are expected to? These books is perhaps the wrong term, but yeah.
Completely. I completely agree with all of that. And it's something I feel very strongly about, because there isn't an end point. That's the thing. When you're dealing with lifelong trauma and mental illness, there isn't a moment when you wake up and everything's now okay. It's a lifelong challenge. So if you're abused as a child, that trauma stays with you for life. You have to live with it for life. If you have mental health issues and conditions, they are with you for life. So I wanted to be really clear that I was writing this book at a very specific point in my life. It stops at a very specific point, and there would be no resolution, because there is no resolution. I continue just to live and to try and manage it and hope I don't end up back in that place. But I think it's an incredibly dangerous narrative to set out, because people are in the grips of the most unimaginable pain and trauma and mental health kind of spirals, and what they see is, oh, you'll be okay when you reach this point, and you don't reach that point, and you feel like a failure, and you feel like you're somehow kind of an outlier and you're doing it wrong somehow. So I really strongly didn't want that in there. But it is interesting, because again, it's been another thing. A few readers have found me on Instagram and needed to know that I was okay now, and needed to know that I'd resolved it. And I do now have a partner, and I have a 1-year-old son, and I'm the most stable mentally and emotionally I've been in my life. But it's interesting that people need that kind of moment to say, oh, well, it's all okay now, because that's something I think we've come to expect from books, from literature generally, but especially from memoir. From memoir, people need the happy ending, quote unquote. And I did resist it, and I would resist it if I had to do it all again, even though I think it may alienate some readers who really, really need that as part of the book.
Yeah, I recently read Scar Tissue, actually, and it very much fits that narrative of ending with, him getting clean and his dog never seeing him use. I wondered whether, you said you found the writing process therapeutic ultimately, but I wondered when you were sort of in the whole thing on the page, whether you found it sort of difficult to relive those experiences, and whether even now, sort of talking about them in interviews such as these, whether you find it difficult to talk about it sort of repeatedly.
Yeah, I mean, I find it therapeutic with distance, but as you say, not in the moment. So as I was writing it, I said to my boyfriend afterwards, it was like having my skin kind of lifted off and placed back on every day. And I found the writing of it incredibly difficult, incredibly painful. And actually, for the first few months after I'd finished the book, I was like, why do people say this is therapeutic? That was horrendous. It felt like a compulsion. It felt like something I had to do, but it did not in any way feel enjoyable or pleasant or helpful. And then actually, it's only with a bit of passage of time that it's begun to feel like that. But I think I figured going in that it would be difficult, because I was revisiting stuff I deliberately suppressed for decades and decades. I hadn't told my best friends about it. I hadn't told some of my partners about it. There were very few people in the world I'd actually verbalized it to. That's kind of why writing had always been really important to me, because it became the safest relationship in my life, and one that I could control. And the page knew everything, even when everybody else didn't. So I did find it incredibly painful, but I don't in any way, I have to say, regret it at all.
How did you find that kind of catharsis through writing, or the therapeutic effect of that, with your experience of professional psychiatric care, with the sort of medical approach to mental distress and therapy and things like that? How did you find the comparison between those two experiences?
I mean, I've only really intersected previously with mental health services and psychiatric care when I've been in crisis. So when I've attempted suicide twice were the two times that I really engaged with it, basically because you have to, because you're in hospital and you know you have to engage with it to be able to get out. And when you're in a psychiatric hospital, as I was in New York, your only aim at that point is to get out, not actually to get better or to try and, you know, work through anything. You're literally like, get me out of here, this is hell, this is a nightmare. So it's only actually in recent years that I've properly engaged with it, that I've got on a proper course of medication, that I do therapy. And I think writing for me was a replacement for all of that. Not necessarily a satisfactory one, I have to say, because there are certain things writing can't do. There are certain, obviously, medical reasons that I need to take medication, and there are certain services that a qualified therapist can really help me with that writing can't. But I think writing was my treatment for a long time, and it will always be. I still write when I'm in distress or when I'm struggling with something. But I think these days I'm hopefully at 41 finally mature enough to know that it has to be all of those things together.
You've mentioned that lots of the material in the book will be new to people that are close to you, of course. Are you still uncomfortable to a degree with that sort of level of personal detail being out there, or are you sort of past that now, you've overcome that sort of mental barrier about the material?
Probably, weirdly, a bit of both. I think anybody who says they're completely now fine with it just can't be telling the truth, because whichever way you cut it, you are sharing something that has been incredibly shameful to you probably for decades. So the thing with sexual abuse, particularly as a child, is the level of shame that you carry with you, especially as you become a woman, how that affects your womanhood, how that affects how you see yourself, how that affects how you see sex. Everything is coloured by this one experience, and shame is baked into that. And you also keep it a secret, and secrecy incubates shame at the same time. So unpicking that and stepping away from that is incredibly difficult. I do remember, though, the day the book came out, I'd been so scared, really scared about revealing that amount of detail about myself, about what people would think, professionally, what would people think at work, would people no longer trust me, would they think I'd been lying to them for years. And the day the book came out, I just felt this overwhelming feeling of relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore, and that relief is still there for sure. There is still elements of shame that I kind of struggle with, but I think that's perfectly natural for somebody in my situation, and I think I work really hard to kind of get rid of that. But I think that's probably something I'll struggle with for years to come, because I think that's just part of how society views that stuff, and how we as women are taught to see that stuff as well that's happened to us.
Following on from that point, what do you think about the debate about kind of women in particular selling trauma, as it were? And maybe that's a crude way to put it, but particularly the sort of first-person industrial complex, the way it's suggested, and the different way that these pieces of writing are perceived by women and by men. I mean, did you feel you were kind of in control of this process? How do you feel about that discussion about the kind of gendered aspect of it?
I mean, there are a couple of parts to it. One of which is definitely the gender aspect, which is men write essays and women write confessional pieces. You know, there is a great history of men writing incredible first-person narratives, and they're not considered in the same way. But at the same time, I do worry for young female journalists and writers who may feel that the way that they can develop a reputation for their writing is to have to write those stories. I didn't write those stories for the first couple of decades of my career, and when I did write them, I was very specific about where they were published, about what I was willing to write. So the first First person piece I actually wrote was for The Pool, which was the website started by Sam Baker of Red Magazine and Lauren Laverne. And they just did brilliant women-centred journalism, and I trusted them implicitly, and I wrote about our time spent in a refuge, mainly because I was furious about government cuts. And I wrote this piece, and I was very, very careful about writing it, about what I said, about what I included about my family, because their stories are their stories, not mine. And I've always said to young female journalists that I know, please be sure that you want to write about that, because it is out there forever, and it will be out there forever. And you will meet the number of dates I've been on, and I'll meet a man and he'd say, oh, I Googled you and this came up about you. And you have to be prepared that people know stuff about you before they even have met you. And I wouldn't want young women journalists to think that is the way that they need to get published, or if they want to write a book, that they have to write a confessional memoir. I do think there's a snobbery around memoir, and there's a shame about, women selling trauma, that this awful thing happens to you, and because of, late stage capitalism, you go out and try and flog it to the highest bidder. That's never how I've seen it, and I feel like memoir is an incredibly powerful form, but the way it's considered, especially at the moment, can be incredibly reductive. And I think I spent a long time thinking and writing before I put this book out there. I don't know if I'll ever write non-fiction again. I'm actually writing fiction at the moment, but it was a book I felt compelled to write. And there was a little bit when my book came out, I could sense a little bit of snobbery around the form, which I found incredibly frustrating. The writing in Coming Undone was as important to me as the story, and the craft of the writing was as important to me as the story. It isn't enough to have a shocking, upsetting, raw story. For me, your job as a writer is to tell a compelling story as artfully as possible. So yeah, as I said, there are multiple parts to that. Multiple parts of it infuriate me. But as I say, I don't want women to think that is their only option.
I saw that Coming Undone has been optioned for television. I wondered, in terms of, in a sort of dream scenario, who you would like to sort of translate your voice to the screen.
In terms of a writer?
Yeah. We
do actually have a writer attached, which is very exciting. So I don't want to say too much in case I give that person away. But what I would say is, I've always thought Coming Undone was a very difficult book to adapt, because the stuff in New York is present day. It's in two tenses, and it's in present day in New York, and it's much more immediate and much faster. And the stuff in my childhood is past tense, and some of it's quite dreamlike. It's stitched together memory, it's stitched together visceral experience. And there is lots of stuff I don't include. There's a decade in London where I became a magazine editor, which I didn't include because to me that had no relevance to the story I was trying to tell. And the story of the memoir was how this thing here in my childhood led to this moment here in New York. And people often want a completist narrative, and for me a memoir is telling a very specific part of your story. So those were the bits that I was interested in, but there's all that bit missing. A couple of people have contacted me and said, I was hoping for more like glamorous party scenes in New York, as opposed to just scene after scene of me drinking myself into blackout every night, which is decidedly unglamorous. And so there aren't maybe the traditional scenes you'd expect in the book, and I always thought that would make Coming Undone a challenge to adapt. But I think what it also presents is an opportunity to fill those gaps in television, because the book for me is one part of my story, not the entire story. So I think it will take a writer with real imagination and also just real boldness, because the material is difficult, incredibly difficult, and it doesn't play it safe in any way. And I think for a writer to be able to see how they can translate that into a script that will play effectively on television will take a very special, very spirited, very empathetic writer for sure.
I know you're not in touch with your mum, right? But what was the response from the rest of your family? And I suppose I don't know if you're happy answering this, but what do you think your mum would think about it?
So I'm not in touch with my mum or my dad, and I am very close to my brother and sister. And actually, my brother read it before publication because he had to verify some of the things in the book. And he learned a lot of stuff for the first time, especially a lot of the stuff from when I was an adult and how ill I was in New York when nobody in my family really knew what was going on. And he was, incredibly just wonderful about it and understood why I felt the need to write the book, and was incredibly supportive. Spoke of feeling guilty that he didn't know and hadn't been able to help me, but when you're that ill, if you choose to make that completely invisible to people, you can and you will, and I did. My sister was incredibly supportive as well, but neither of them are really mentioned in the book. There's one mention of them when we're walking down a path, and I made that choice very deliberately because, as I said earlier, my story is my story and theirs is theirs, and it is not my place to tell theirs. And the same really with my mum. So I made a choice very early on that I would only include stories about my mum if it was directly relevant to me and the story I was telling. So there were lots of terrible incidents that I chose not to include because they would have just been there to paint her in a certain way, and there wasn't any immediate consequence for me that made sense in the kind of narrative of the book. So I would hope that she would think it was fair. I would hope that she would understand why I maybe felt the need to write the book. I don't know if she's read it. She may well have done. But I didn't in any way feel... I knew that I'd been responsible around the people in the book, and I knew that I'd been more than fair. So I didn't in any way, and I thought I might feel guilty or worried or, like I'd screwed anybody over or anything like that, because I hope I went out of my way to do the opposite.
Message from our sponsor, Vitsu. Marta's story.
If only each shelf could talk, reflected Marta, a Vitsu customer since 2004. Her shelving system began modestly and has grown over the years. It travelled with her from London to Valencia and now Amsterdam. This is the 5th time Marta has bought from Vitsu. Every time, she speaks with her personal Vitsu planner, Robin, who reorganised her bookshelves to fit her Spanish walls and her Dutch house. He even sent her extra packaging to protect her shelves with each move. You might say that their relationship has become a friendship over the years. Marta knows she is valued and trusts the advice Robin gives.
If your shelves could talk, what would they say? Vitsu's 606 Universal Shelving System is a modular, adaptable kit of parts. It can form the perfect home for your books and even the desk from which to write one. Visit vitsu.com, vitsoe.com, or request a free brochure via email at vitsu.com by quoting ATN 606.
Vitsu, makers of long-living furniture by Dieter Rams.
Could we track back now and talk about your, how you got started in journalism in your 20s? Am I right in thinking you started as a PA before you got your first job at Women and Home?
Yes, so I did work experience on the reception desk of Marie Claire. I can't believe even receptionists got their own intern. But yeah, I was an intern on reception. Wasn't even allowed in the actual office. I couldn't move off reception. That was a fun 3 months. And then I went back the following summer and got promoted to a features department intern, which was terribly exciting because I was allowed in the office. And when I was there, I found out that the magazine upstairs was looking for a PA and an editorial assistant. So I got that job, was there 9 months, the magazine closed, and then I got a job as features assistant at Woman and Home and kind of went from there. My ambition was always to be a magazine editor before I was 30, which was a completely arbitrary thing that I decided. I'd always been very ambitious and driven, and work and school had always been a real kind of escape for me from home and then from kind of the difficulties of my own mind. So, and then I became editor of Shortlist, which was the men's magazine, when I was 29.
A big theme that comes up in a lot of our interviews is how difficult it is for people to break into the media if they don't have family in London, if they don't have financial support from their parents and stuff like that. Coming from the very difficult place you were in, but not just what was going on domestically, but also where you were economically. How did you do it? Like, how did you make it work?
Oh God, it was a nightmare, but I have to say it's way worse now. So when I did work experience, I came down to London. It was only the second time I'd ever been to London in my life. Came to London, stayed in a student halls in Bethnal Green. I think this was 1999. I think I paid 35 quid a week maybe for that room. And at night I worked at Marie Claire in the day for free, obviously, because all internships were free. And at night I worked for a company that basically was an agency for stock refillers. So you would go into a store after it had closed, like the big Top Shop, RIP, but I did do it in there, and you would restock the shelves and replenish the shelves. So I would do that at night, and then I would go to Marie Claire in the day. So, I mean, it wasn't, I hate to sound all Oliver Twist about it, but it was quite difficult. So I only really had enough money to either get the tube to work every day or have lunch. So I'd alternate. One day I'd walk and have lunch the next day. And I remember when I was the features department intern, they used to send me out for coffees every day at 3:00 for the team. And I remember thinking, when I move to London and I get a job, I'm going to buy a coffee every day. And that was like a really exciting goal for me. And when I moved down, in the end, it was because I got this job. It was paying 18 grand, which at the time was like the most money I'd ever seen in my entire life. And that job just changed my life. The man who gave me that job is now a very close friend. He became my mentor. He was editorial director of Shortlist and Stylist, edited FHM and Men's Health. And I always say to him, he absolutely changed and saved my life, because getting that job was just the start of everything for me. But I wouldn't have been able to move to London without a full-time job paying half decently as that one did.
What were the sort of things you were doing in that features assistant role? And what was sort of the journey from there to the launch team at Nuts magazine?
So the features assistant role was amazing because I was 21, 22, working on a magazine for empty nesters, women going through the menopause. But I worked with an incredible journalist called Tessa Hilton, who was one of the kind of first and most senior women on Fleet Street. And she'd taken this job after her newspaper career. She did it part-time, and she was my boss. And she was an incredible woman to learn from. So, I would do case study interviews for her, and she would send me these notes back. I would hear her behind me typing all capital notes into my copy. And I can still, when I interview people and when I write up that copy, I can still hear her voice. Well, I can hear her notes, should I say, in my head, in all caps. And so that was a brilliant learning for me, and grounding in how to interview people, in how to just create great copy. And then from there I went to Now magazine, where I was the true life writer. So I was doing a lot of case study led stuff there. And then my first boss, who turned mentor, called me up and said they were launching a magazine. They couldn't tell me anything about it, but did I want to go and do it? And I was 23. It was good money. It was a deputy news editor job, if I remember rightly. And so I bit his hand off, and that's what became Nuts magazine.
Can we talk about then what it was like working there, and maybe just kind of where it fitted into the market, and particularly given how kind of cultural sensibilities about men's mags and stuff have evolved since then? So we had Ed Needham on the show a few weeks ago who edited FHM back in the day, and he was pretty thoughtful about this. But what was it like, what was the kind of raison d'etre of the magazine, and what was your experience as a young woman in that environment like?
Well, when it started, I remember, I was already employed there when I found out what the magazine was called and what it was going to be about, which that was always the way it worked. It seems mad to me now. But and I remember thinking, oh God, that name is terrible. Oh God, I've got to say every day I'm going to have to pick up the phone and say, hello, Nuts magazine. That is just mortifying. But it started out very different than it ended up. So if you look at the first couple of issues, it was pitched as, and I'm not joking, the magazine for fathers and sons to enjoy together, for you to put on your coffee table. So the very first copies had Nell McAndrew in some workout gear. I think issue 3 or 4 had Beyonce in a top and a skirt. Like, there was no nudity. There was no kind of glamour models weren't really a thing. The Real Girl explosion, which was real girls sending in pictures of themselves in their underwear, hadn't begun. So it was about football. It was about true crime. I did a lot of true crime stuff. It was about cars. It was kind of a weekly version of FHM and Loaded was its original inception. And that weekly market, which had traditionally been a female thing, just exploded. The perceived wisdom had always been men will not buy a magazine every week. But Mike Sutar, who was then the MD, I think, and Phil Hilton, the editor, saw a gap, and there was another magazine happening across the city at the same time with the same idea called Zoo Magazine. That if men bought daily newspapers, which they did at that point in their millions and millions, and they bought monthly magazines, which they also did in their hundreds of thousands, then why wouldn't they buy a weekly magazine? And it was huge. I mean, at its height, I think it was selling 320,000, but there was a definite pivot where obviously nudity came in, where glamour models replaced celebrities, where the focus became more on titillation and on sex. And, you know, when you look back on it now, I wrote a piece for The Observer just after I'd left, because I was very conscious, especially the work we did towards the end, which was about real girls who were, by and large, working class girls who saw the success of glamour models and thought that this would be their way out of their situation. So they thought if they got published in Nuts magazine, they would get an agent, they would earn lots of money, they would be able to buy their own house, which happened to literally 2 or 3 girls, but in the main they just sent in their pictures, we published them, and that was it. And I was very conscious that for me, it was an incredibly successful period in my life. I was earning enough money to be financially independent, which had always been my concern coming from my background. I got promoted a few times. I was still only in my 20s. But, you know, the more you look at it, the more I became aware that I, as a working class woman myself, I was benefiting from exploitation, you could say, of other working class women, because I was essentially saying to them, as part of that magazine, we're going to give you the opportunity to get out of your area, your situation, when really that was never going to happen. We were just kind of using that to sell magazines. And I don't think also you can underestimate the impact that those magazines had on young men and young women. What were we teaching young men who read the magazine? It was never intended for teenage boys, but all magazines have been read by younger people than the intended demographic. What were we teaching those young men about sex? What were we teaching them about the value of women? I mean, I consider myself a feminist, and I worked on that magazine. I did eventually leave. I was increasingly uncomfortable, and I wasn't the only person with where we were going and what we were doing, and the amount of nudity and the amount of sex and how the magazine had changed. But let's be clear, I didn't stand up the day that we announced we were doing more nudity and throw down my pen and say, I can't do this. I probably worked there for about a year after that.
I read that piece that you mentioned, and I remember the anecdote about chopping off women's heads so that it was just the breast, basically, was an arresting one. And I like the way that you described it as sort of using their breasts as a sort of career stepping stone for you. I guess I wonder whether it's I don't know whether you regret it, but whether you sort of, how you look back on that period now and what you learned from it, and whether you thought you could have learned the same thing somewhere else.
Yeah, so I think part of it was I think the working classness of it, if you like, is intrinsically bound up in it. I was terrified that I was going to, right up until I was probably 35, I was terrified I was going to have to go back to the village, that I was going to be expelled from London somehow, that I was going to be found out for not being a good journalist, that I was no, not good enough to be amongst the kind of middle class people I work with in journalism, and I was constantly insecure about losing my job and not having any money. I had no plan B, I had no fallback. I didn't have parents who were ever willing to help me out, or able to help me out, but not willing either. So if I lost my job, I knew that I would have to leave London and go where, I'm not sure. But that insecurity and that fear and panic drove me a lot of my 20s, to the detriment, I think, of some good decision making, in terms of, as I say, Nuts was not that when we started. There were some brilliant journalists on it, some brilliant magazine editors on it, some of the best in the industry. But when it took a very specific turn, that should have been the point at which I walked. But let's be clear that the people who can afford to walk are people with the economic stability and the support, and who are usually middle class and have parental support. There is a reality that does enable you to make decisions in a very different way. And I absolutely regret it, because now I look back on it and think, of course I'd have got another job, of course I'd have been fine. But when you're 25, 26, you can't see that. All you can see is that you're desperate to have a career, you're desperate to not have to go back to where I'd spent my entire life running away from. And that kind of drove every decision I made and made me quite single-minded. And I do regret that, but I don't know how I would have changed that, knowing how I felt at 25 and 26.
Could you talk us through the career steps that went after that, from Maxim to Shortlist to New York? How did this work? And what kind of, in retrospect, do you think allowed you to move at such an incredible pace up the hierarchy?
I think it was to be honest, my desperation, my panic, and my ambition. And my ambition was born out of desperation and panic. But also, I'd learned at a very young age at school that you could be rewarded for being clever, or you could be rewarded for hard work. That all this negativity at home and all this chaos and violence and awfulness at home, that you could create a space where none of that existed, where actually you were rewarded for all the right things. And I carried that through into my work, and I thought, if I could build this other reality where I was able to succeed, and where everything was seen in a positive light, and where I could work hard, and where all of that would be rewarded. And I think the economic side of it was very, very important to me, which is, my mum had never been financially independent. Our family had existed on benefits, and she'd relied on her partners. And, that meant that she didn't have her own car. So she couldn't escape the house and drive away. It meant she couldn't take us and leave somebody, because she had no money to be able to take us anywhere, to even pay for a night in a B&B. And I saw the consequences of having complete economic dependence on somebody else, or even just complete economic dependence on the state. Like, she had no other options. And I was always determined that I would have options, that it would be in my control. And that's, I think, what drove my ambition and my determination to prove that I was good enough and that I was something. When you've kind of had the childhood that I had, you internalize a lot of what you're told, which is, you're nothing, you're nobody, you'll never be anything, and part of your drive becomes a desire to prove that person or those people wrong. And I never stayed too long anywhere, is probably fair, until Empire, my current job, I've been there 5.5 years, which is the longest I've been anywhere. And so I was constantly focused on a path, which is, how do I get to be an editor as quickly as possible? And when I was at Maxim, I saw that magazine was probably going to close soon, that it wasn't doing so well. So I actually just quit, and then called my old boss, who was launching Shortlist, which was going to be the big free men's weekly, and said, do you have a job for me? And he had one job left, and he gave me that. And that was kind of, again, another big turning point in my career.
I noticed from your LinkedIn that you were freelance for, the best part of a year. How did you find that in terms of the sort of financial aspect of that? Was it a bit unnerving to have that more sort of feast and famine type income?
Yeah, it was for 9 months, I think, and it was just awful. I am not suited to being a freelancer. Maybe I am these days, but not then, because again, I didn't have, I lived paycheck to paycheck, and so the thought of being freelance where people don't pay your invoice for like 60 days was frightening. And I was single for all of that period, and I lived alone, so I was entirely responsible for paying my rent. So that wasn't, I mean, I enjoyed the freedom of doing multiple projects. I was kind of consulting on magazines, I was doing shifts, working on digital projects for newspapers and things like that. So I loved the variety and getting to do lots of other things. But yeah, the stability side of it was still quite terrifying, because I think I was 31 at that point. So I still wasn't entirely financially secure enough for it not to be an issue.
Could you tell us about Time Out and then about Empire? We've covered some of the mental health difficulties you had, but just from about the magazines themselves, about what you were doing at Time Out, and then about your job at Empire now.
So I was taken into Time Out with a very specific mission. I love a mission. That's where I'm at my best. And Time Out New York had been around for something like 17 years. But it kind of, the management team felt it'd become a bit staid, a bit traditional. It kind of did the same cover the same week every year. And they wanted to make it a proper multi-platform brand. So I think at that point they had a couple of people working on the website who just sat in a corner by themselves. Everybody else worked on the print mag, this massive team. And they said to me, we want you to go in and modernise it, bring the team together so everybody's working across it, make sure the social media is working, newsletters, events. And so I went in with that kind of brief, and I was probably, in retrospect, a bit of a bull in a china shop. So I immediately did a big restructure. That meant quite a few people left the magazine. I brought in a new team. Completely restructured how people worked, so they worked across everything, and then redesigned the magazine to make it more modern. Start to do things that I thought were more disruptive. So instead of doing 50 best meals, we did are you a New Yorker because you're anxious, or are you anxious because you're a New Yorker? We did a whole issue on rage in New York and why people are so angry, and start to do things, because I always felt like Time Out at its best was part of the fabric of the city. It didn't just reflect the culture, it was the culture, that you helped to create the culture, and that you spoke to both the good and the bad of the city, because every city is amazing and awful at the same time, and to tap into both of those things to try and work out the alchemy of why people lived in New York, what they wanted to talk about. So we did that quite quickly, and we started to put celebrities back on the cover again. We shot Lena Dunham with a Warhol riff when I was there. We brought together Julian Casablancas and Karen O, because it had been 10 years since that music scene on the Lower East Side. We shot them together, and we started to do all of these things to hopefully bring a bit of life back to the print product, but also to get the brand talked about again. And then when I was there, the business decided to take it free. Like the London magazine was free, so we did that as well. And it was only 18 months I was there in the end, because I was offered the Empire job, and obviously I'd been unwell. And this was the weird thing, is the magazine, it was one of the best jobs of my life. The magazine won loads of awards, I won awards, like the business were really happy with what was happening. The website traffic had gone through the roof. It was happy days. And then at the same time, I was also the most seriously ill I'd been in my life, and that was probably the most extreme example of me being able to juggle this really successful day job with this private life that was a complete mess. But it was an incredible job. And then the call came about Empire, and I didn't think I was quite done with Time Out, but I figured that whoever got the editor job of Empire would be there a long time, because the editors of Empire tend to be there a long time. And I also knew that I was still quite unwell, and that New York, for whatever reason, was exacerbating and incubating that illness, and that if I stayed in the city, I think I'd have probably ended up dead, to be perfectly honest. So it was quite an easy decision in some respects. although I had to kind of fight those voices going, who leaves? Like, I've got this amazing job with a massive office overlooking 10th Avenue and the Hudson. My office at Time Out was pretty much the same size as my entire team office here in the UK. Good money, living in Manhattan, but it was not going well personally. So so then I came back for Empire in September 2015.
Was your mission at Empire in some ways similar to the one at Time Out in terms of bringing all that multi-platform stuff, together? I was interested to read about the commissioning process for a issue with James Cameron, in terms of, getting him to do stuff for video, getting him stuff to do for the podcast, as well as the print edition and things for online. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the commissioning process has changed?
Yeah, so Empire's always been an incredible magazine, print magazine, always. And then they had this very successful website, and this podcast grew up out of it about 8 years ago. But none of these things really spoke to each other. They were handled by different people in the team. They didn't really talk to each other necessarily. And, the Empire team is probably a quarter of my team at Time Out New York. But they are the most incredibly passionate, which you'd expect on a specialist title, but still they're the most incredibly passionate, dedicated group of people I've ever worked with. And it was just kind of trying to bring the whole brand together so it spoke the same language. So if you were on the website or in the magazine or on social or on the podcast, even though they have different jobs, that you should know you're in the same place, that you should know you're with the same people. But at the same time, I also wanted to allow the individual voices within the brand to come out. We have incredible writers on Empire, we have incredible broadcasters, and to allow them to develop their voice under the kind of bigger Empire tone. And then again, we just wanted to do things to get more talkability and to modernise the magazine. So I felt like the magazine had an opportunity to continue to be relevant. I think the death of a print magazine is when you essentially become almost a tribute to yourself. So you've been going 30 years and, here you are talking about old films again and the same filmmakers. And for me, you should be able to rip off the cover of a magazine, including the date, and you should be able to know the year and preferably the month in which that magazine was published. It should reflect and speak to the life and the culture we exist in now. And I didn't think that Empire always did that at that point. So we did a complete redesign again, and we've tried to make it more discursive, because film now is a big conversation. It's not us giving you, the film fan, information. Film is a huge conversation, and tried to make it kind of maybe a bit more vibrant and bold, and also broadened out who Empire is for and who it covers. So for me, Empire should be something that is enjoyed by any and all film fans. If you love film, Empire should be your home. And I think it's fair to say that for many years, the filmmakers we focused on, for example, were very white and male. I don't think anybody would argue with that. And what we wanted to do as a team was to make Empire more representative of the film community and of film fans, and we should be talking about a female director or a black director with as much regularity and passion and prominence as we do a James Cameron or a Steven Spielberg. So that's been kind of the big push on the mag, is to make it much more diverse and representative, because that's what film is. Film is rich and diverse, and it has its issues, and it's had its issues over the years. But, this year we've got 2 women in the running for Best Director at the Oscars for the first time in history. There's still a huge amount to be done, but we are at, I think, an exciting point where things can actually change. And as the world's biggest film magazine, Empire has to be part of that change, and it had to open its doors to everybody who loves film, not just a particular type of person. And that for me was the big mission that we continue on with today.
So we're coming up against the end of our time, but I just had one final question, which was about the difference between American and British journalism. This is a real strand that comes up in a lot of interviews, and I went to journalism school in New York, and I worked there in my early jobs as well. And And how have you found that kind of cultural difference? You've mentioned just the resources, there's different staff and things, but how have you, what's your experience of that?
I mean, US publishing is a business. I mean, I know British publishing, but my God, it's a business in America. Like, the P&L is something else entirely. It's much bigger money. I mean, just because of the amount of, look at America as a country. My friend edits People magazine. I think their circulation is 3.2 million. I mean, America is massive, so everything's bigger, everything is, I think, slightly more intense. I think the working culture in New York, certainly what I experienced, is insane, quite frankly. Like 16, 18-hour days, people emailing you in the middle of the night expecting an answer. I was definitely guilty of then emailing my staff on a weekend, like being furious they didn't reply, because that was the culture. The culture, I think, can be very unhealthy. I think there's probably been some people have had to start looking at that recently, I think, but I found it very aggressive, very much a business. And I found US publishing actually much more conservative, which again, I suppose makes sense given the nature of the country. But British publishing has always been scrappy, a bit weird, a bit bonkers. Look at some of the magazines this country has produced, some of the ideas. Think about More Magazine, Position of the Fortnight. You ever imagine that existing in like Atlanta or something? British magazines have always had a verve and a spirit, and they haven't always lasted, and they've kind of come and gone. But I've always felt like the ideas and the innovation and the willingness to try something in British publishing has always been something I've been really drawn to. And maybe that is because the stakes aren't so high, because we don't sell 3.2 million magazines a week. But I honestly think British magazine media is one of the best in the world. And I know it's obviously had a really tricky time and not all magazines have survived, but it is still a really rich, vibrant industry that I think still, even in these difficult days, embraces change and embraces continued risk and innovation. And I think risk and innovation is the only thing that will save this industry.
Well, that seems like a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Terri, for your time and for speaking so candidly. It was great to get you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Terri White. You can follow her on Twitter at Terri with an I_White, and you can buy her book Coming Undone, which is published by Canongate. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your main takeaway from the interview with Terri?
I thought it was very moving, actually, and I thought she spoke very candidly about her book, but also about what writing such a revealing and very personal book was like. And I think really, really brave act of her to do that, and laudable, and also to come on and speak very honestly. And also, I think honesty was a big thread through it, the way she spoke about her early career and how she felt about some of those earlier jobs that she did, and how she was able to have this ostensibly extremely kind of successful life, but actually was in a real state of turmoil and distress internally. What about you?
Yeah, I really appreciate her candor about, everything, but in particular working at Nuts, a magazine which now is obviously considered, it's not particularly fondly remembered, and her talking about her financial position and saying, she didn't have something else to fall back on. And actually it was important that she took that job and gained that experience to be able to continue in journalism and get other jobs. So I thought that was really refreshing, especially given that journalism can be quite a middle class world. So yeah, I think it was great to get her perspective.
Yeah, and good, as ever, to discuss the financial aspects of it. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support our crowdfunder on Patreon, we're on there as Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.